Hello and welcome to This Is Not an Episode, a bi-weekly podcast about where philosophy meets the world, quietly, awkwardly, and sometimes all too loudly. Each episode explores how philosophical ideas surface in public life, from fashion and faith to AI and funding politics. Who are we? Well, I'm Jonathan Tallant and I'm a philosopher. Andy, who are you?
Well, I'm Andy Fisher, and I'm also a philosopher.
Tremendous news. Andy, what have you been up to this week?
Well, I've done lots of things. I went to a very interesting workshop on inclusive teaching and how to teach in an inclusive way. So how you might make your teaching suitable for people autistic or people who have visual impairment, etc., etc. I think the take-home message was rule out as much ambiguity in all that you do. So make it very clear. So that was useful. I'm going to apply that to my modules and my teaching in the future. What about you?
That sounds great, Andy. It's in the run-up to term starting here at the University of Nottingham, and given some of my roles, rather than preparing to teach, I've actually been working in the background to try and make sure that all the structures of necessary things are in place so that my colleagues can go and do that teaching. So lots of going to meetings, lots of writing guidance documents, and trying to make sure that everything is facing in the right kind of direction. I wouldn't say it's massively exciting.
Would you say it's boring?
Well, Andy, I was thinking it might be a little bit on the dull side for sure. And you this week want us to praise boring art.
That's right. I've been reading a very interesting article by Gibson and Elpidora, and it sort of goes against one of the assumptions we have, namely that good art always has to be interesting. And the thesis is that there are some art which is boring, and because it's boring is also good art. So that's weird because we think boringness is about like meaninglessness and sort of like falling asleep and apathy and these sort of things. But their thesis is, look, that can be the case. Of course it can. But their thesis is there are some things like what Warhol's Empire, which is just a massively long film where nothing happens in it. That's good art, but also boring, and it's good because it's boring. So that's a sort of thesis on that.
That is kind of interesting, and I don't really know where to go with that. Right, that's just a sort of that's a nice tight observation that is really surprising and counterintuitive. But it sounds right. Now you've given the example and walked us through it. What can we do with that, Andy?
I think it makes us reflect on how we've come to see what art is generally. So the sort of modernisms change on how we see what art is. So thinking about the world and its labor and its capital and all those sort of things. So I think it might shake the canons of what we think art actually is. But also I think maybe seeing that when we experience boredom, it can be used as a vehicle to open up other things. So points of reflection, sort of almost oppressiveness that we feel with time. So maybe it's a way of embracing some of these things that we feel in certain ways, and also shaking the cans. But apart from that, I think it just removes perhaps some snobbery around what art is. It's a bit
That's
like
really
the stuff on everyday objects being aesthetically interesting. Sorry.
No, I like that. I like that. And I guess I was just thinking about other forms of art because initially when you started talking about it, I was queued up to thinking about visual art. Then I was wondering about film and books and thinking about some of my experiences of reading bits of literature and thinking at the time, finding them quite boring and not being very excited by them, finding them quite oppressive and quite dull. But some of those, reflecting back, are some of my favorite experiences of reading. There's a book that I read a few years ago now that's really striking for me in that way. I think it's Vernon God Little, that at the time I just found incredibly boring, without any offense to the author or anyone else who liked it. But reflecting back on it, there are some moments, there are some descriptions, and the boredom of it is just such an integral part of my experience of reading that I really now reflect very fondly on the book, which I had found quite strange until you've given me that frame there.
Yes, and I think the key thing there is that the boredom isn't an add-on. It was necessary for you to get to that aesthetic state or whatever. Absolutely. I think, yeah, I just think it's a very interesting take, and a new way to look at the idea of boredom in some context. I mean, some things I think are boring to different people, and we don't think they're all of aesthetic value. So, for example, for me, football is pretty boring. Watching it, um, I must say, I dip in as a fair weather fan to sort of the England games and various other things, but I'm not a follower of these games. But you were watching some stuff on, or a footballer. This is where my ignorance shows. A footballer talking about some football team, and how they invoke philosophy. Isn't that right?
That's the best link I've ever heard, Andy.
Amazing.
That was pure gold. Yeah, so there's as many people I'm sure listening will know, and I'm sure you know really, Andy, just being modest and linking across. Ruben Amorim is the manager of Manchester United, the football team, and he has a reputation for being, I guess, fairly stubborn in the way that he sets up his team and the way that he wants them to play. So he has a particular formation, a particular style he wants them to play in. And there's this nice article on ESPN about him being really defiant that he won't change his philosophy with the team, despite the fact that results aren't coming to be the sorts of things that they would wish at the moment. I think that there are plenty of folks around who are quite pleased with the way that Man United are performing, but Man United fans are not. Ruben Amorim is not pleased with this, and there's a bit of pressure on him to change his philosophy, or so he describes it. And one of the reasons that I was really interested in talking this through with you is just that way that philosophy as a term gets bandied around in these kinds of contexts. Because I think if you talk to someone about what philosophy is, they'll say, well, it's about reading and thinking, and you need to read some Hegel and some Marx and whoever else it is, maybe some Plato and Socrates. Pick your favorite philosopher. But the way that philosophy as a term gets thrown around in these kinds of contexts is a set of ideals, a set of thoughts. And I guess to start with, I was just interested in how you thought about those two different ways of philosophy being used and thought about.
Yeah, that is interesting. And there is actually a third way. So you said, you talk to people about philosophy and they often talk about Hegel and things. So I think you just hang around with cleverer people. um, when if you talk about philosophy to the non-philosopher, they'll often slip into thinking about spiritualism, New Ageism, prophecy. I remember telling someone I did philosophy and they asked me to tell them their fortune. So it's that approach. But I think there are links to some of these things, and actually, I think there's links across the history of philosophy. So I think in the olden days, that's the extent of my history knowledge. In the olden days, philosophy is much more tied into how you were as a person, how you lived, and how you died. And then think of Socrates, drinking hemlock because of his convictions. It wasn't just a bolt on or whatever. Whereas I think philosophy often in the circles we work in is much more about analysis, conceptual ground clearing, and about fitting things into what we think is the best at that time. And that might change rather than a sort of dogmatic commitment where we use tools to try and justify that. So I think in some sense, maybe the Man United person's drawing on an older conception of philosophy. Yeah, I'm being immensely charitable here. I think in some sense it's just being stubborn, right? But if we take him what he's saying, it seems like more of an old, more old-fashioned. I don't mean that pejoratively, but an older notion of philosophy. Does that tie with your thoughts, or not really?
I think it absolutely does, and I like the idea of Socrates insisting that United play 3-4-3. I think this is I can completely get behind this idea. I also wondered a little bit about not just whether Amrim in this context is refusing to change his philosophy, but he's also refusing to change how he feels that philosophy must be implemented. Because I guess, you could have a philosophy that says, in that what guiding your way of life kind of an idea that says, my philosophy is I should always be kind to people. And then sometimes you think, actually, I need to be not so kind to this person because maybe they're behaving aggressively towards me or what have you. Um, and so when he says Amorim's declining to change his philosophy, I kind of think he's not just doing that. He's saying, well, I'm not going to change my ideals, which is, that's fine. But also, am I going to behave in absolute strict accordance with those ideals? And I guess that starts to feel a bit more like dogmatism to
Yeah.
me. Although you go back to the example of Socrates and the hemlock, and you're absolutely right. There's a stubborn guy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, I, I mean, just as a side, um, in talking about football and philosophy, I remember when I was a postgraduate student, playing for the moral philosophers versus the metaphysicians, as in St Andrews. That was quite an experience, and probably the most pretentious philosophy game. Names, at least, you can ever imagine. Um, and there's actually a big tradition of philosophy and football. And of course, I was thinking of the Monty Python's football philosophy
Yeah.
sketch, which is quite very funny.
Who
Yeah, so I
won,
think
Andy?
there's that
Who
tie
won? The
to.
crucial question: Who won?
I don't remember. I just remember doing an incredibly dangerous slide tackle on the son of a very famous, I won't mention their name, very famous, probably one of the world's leading metaphysicians and philosophers of language. So I thought that's academic suicide there and then.
Excellent. Well, I think we should perhaps move on from that then,
Yes.
and perhaps shift on from Ruben Amorim's fixed and fairly strongly held beliefs to a question about who's responsible for extreme beliefs.
Yes, I listened to a podcast on Australian broadcasting corporations, and it was one interviewing a philosopher called Anne Schwembecker, and it was about, as you say, responsibility, but it's actually responsibility for extreme beliefs. So, which is obviously particularly topical at the moment, but has always been topical. So, who are we going to hold responsible for the certain beliefs that we have? And it's very complex. There's lots going on, and she's written some award-winning papers and books on the idea of group responsibility. So what she's really drawing on is stuff in epistemology, so things about knowledge and group knowledge, and the fact that knowledge is socially constructed in some ways. And she says that in some sense, for some things, we are personally responsible for those extreme beliefs. Now, that goes against what is called really, technically called doxastic involuntarism. So you just form beliefs by walking along. You don't choose to have them. You form beliefs about the road and the cars and whatever. So it looks in that case, how can you possibly be responsible for that sort of thing? You just are given them involuntarily. And her point there is, well, you are responsible in as much as you should interrogate the things and question the things you arrive at. You're not just an autonomous that word robot. You should think through the beliefs you have. So that's fair enough. But then you get to more complex situations where people get in things like epistemic bubbles. So epistemic bubbles are claims, groups, situation where people know stuff but incomplete stuff. So you're like in a bubble that's insulated from other knowledge. So the example she gives she came from East Germany and a dictatorship and a censorship. So there's only so much you can know. So in that case, you might hold certain extreme beliefs, but just not know other things. And in that case, she said, well, first you need to ask, is it possible that you could find out? And actually in East Germany, you could probably do some, finding out from West Germany people and talk to them and stuff. So in that case, you are still individually responsible. But in cases where you just don't know and you don't know that and you can't get that information, she said it's the group's responsibility. So what the group needs to do is try its best to get that information. So that's one thing. And then there's a final, and it's really is very interesting and very complex. But the second thing she says, well, what about echo chambers? So they're different
Right.
from the bubble case, echo chambers are where it's not that you've got lack of information, but the people that are putting the information there are bad actors. So you trust these people, but actually they're setting up structures to reinforce in certain ways certain epistemic situations and ruling out by fiat other competing epistemic views. So they've got this idea of preemptively ruling out people. So if I said, well, if I went to one of the meetings you're at and I said, well, someone called Jonathan's going to turn up in 10 minutes. Don't believe anything he possibly says. It's all lies, etc. Which of course I wouldn't do. That means that preemptively I've ruled you out. So echo chambers, anyway, there's mechanisms about how echo chambers work. And the point there is actually you don't hold individuals responsible for the extreme beliefs they might have in echo chambers. Who you hold responsible are the people that maintain the structure of the echo chamber, the Alex Joneses, the people, maybe the cult leaders. So that was really interesting. It shifts the idea of perspective from the individual to the group. And the final thing, which actually ties very much to the idea of philosophy you were talking about, is there's an idea that philosophy can somehow argue people out of echo chambers and bubbles. And what this shows, and I agree, is that's just naive. So you change people who are having entrenched extreme beliefs by relationships and trust, and by group psychology and all these other and counseling and all those sort of things, not by sitting down and arguing with them. Anyway, that was a long thing because it's a very interesting, it was like half an hour, and it's very interesting discussion.
That's really cool, Andy. And I'm gonna unhelpfully completely miss the point of everything that you've just said. We'll come on to that in a minute. But why is it that philosophers always seem to feel the need to use jargon like this? Doxastic involuntarism, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I get it. Doxa
Yeah.
to do with belief, involuntary, you don't have any choice about forming the belief. But my God, we make it difficult for ourselves to talk to anyone else.
Yes, I think that's a great question. And it's a question I've had from non-philosophers a lot, like, you bloody philosophers just making stuff up. I think there's probably two reasons, a charitable and a not a charitable answer.
Go for the uncharitable. Uncharitable, Andy, uncharitable.
Let me start with a more charitable one. The charitable one is just makes life easier. So rather than saying, imagine a case where you just form beliefs and you don't choose to, you just say doxastic involuntarism. You define it and then you can use it in future. So it's just efficiency drives. The other is we just want to sound important, and it gives us certain credence in certain groups. And you have in groups and out groups. And I think that's the same with any language. You can hear it in sport, like in cycling. Oh, the EPO and the cadence and the chapeaus and the bidons and the gilets and all that sort of stuff. Oh, you don't understand that. Well, you're not a proper cyclist.
I can't believe you left out watts per kg, Andy. I mean,
yeah, no, an FTP. Anyway, we could go on. We're in the in group, right? But again, it just feels like a bit like that. There's a sort of select group. It's like kids who make up languages as in little groups to, talk to each other in ways that no one else can and feel special. So that's my uncharitable reason. But my charitable is it's just more efficient to do that, because your papers would, instead of being 8,000, would be 80,000, I guess.
Yeah, and it's okay, Andy. When I'm editing it, I'll edit out the charitable read just to make sure that you don't get any of that in there at all.
Note to self: check edit.
Check the edits. I mean, coming back to the article, which I agree was the podcast, which is really, really interesting, and we'll link to it in the notes. But people should absolutely go and take a look for themselves. I thought it was really interesting to see a philosopher taking quite a nuanced and sort of contextualized approach to things, because I think there is that risk sometimes that philosophers, we're naturally trying to seek those perfectly general answers, to give folks who maybe not quite so familiar a bit of a sense of things. When we're talking about philosophy, we often look for definitions of knowledge or justice or fairness, and these are huge context independent definitions that we're looking for, just absolutely trying to nail these concepts in every context. And it was really lovely to see that more nuanced contextual kind of a consideration coming out here. I don't really know where I'm going with that, other than to just say, yeah, I also thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, you're right. And one other thing I thought about in this discussion is in the educational context. So, and this ties into questions about safe spaces in university. So, why am I saying that? Well, some people say, look, you should allow all ideas, whatever that idea, however extreme supposedly or whatever, you just get lots of people, they talk about stuff, and then the truth sort of flows up to the top like a crucible, like gold in a crucible, and that's it. And everyone goes, aha, I understand what's going on now. I have got rid of my beliefs in whatever it is. And that's a very particular view of education and philosophy in particular. But what sort of in particular postmodernists challenge this, but generally the way of challenging is to think about power and how people hold on and why people hold on to beliefs. And it isn't just because it's the most rational thing to do. People hold on to it because, well, a whole load of things. I remember in my school, people were very big Liverpool fans in my form. And why was that? Well, it's because the form teacher used to talk about Liverpool and have Liverpool mugs, right? And so the social context, the power structures reinforce certain things, and even the body language. So I remember in university, the lecturer might say, well, what do people think about this subject? Whether we should give to charity. And then someone might say, well, a student might say, it depends. And the lecturer would say, well, you could say that. Like, so there's various linguistic ways of silencing and changing structure. So that was a long way of saying, I think this podcast and what you said really speaks to the fact that you can't just argue people. And this is political as well. You can't just argue people into positions. So philosophy's job isn't what we think, which is changing everyone to be really these sort of like Socratic characters.
Fewer togas needed, maybe, than we thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Another, I guess, related to this is the role of teaching the philosophy itself. And you've been reading, I guess, a very interesting and I guess controversial, perhaps, I don't know what you think, article about gender and philosophy.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So it's very much of a piece with other things that I've read, but the basic setup to what's the article is describing is imagining and indeed getting two different groups of students taught with the same material, the absolutely identical material, but having the material then be delivered by either a male lecturer or a female lecturer, or if it's given in the forms of notes, the notes being assigned a male author's name or a male sounding name and a female sounding name. And then getting the students who have experienced either that lecture or that material to rate the material, the experience, and see whether they thought it was really good educationally or really rubbish educationally, and really, really boringly, predictably. The article is describing some work that's been done in Italy, but as I say, it's of a piece with wider research. What you tend to find is that across the piece, students will give higher scores or follow through and take courses with the material or the lecturer that is male. And they will be less inclined to take the course or take seriously the educational content from a female lecturer or a female author. And this kind of really cuts to the quick of the idea that we're really these perfectly rational agents when we're sitting there taking in information and we're only responding to the quality of the information in front of us. We are responding to the people as well. And if we have any biases towards people, so if we have inculcated the bias that men are eccentric and brilliant and insightful and powerful and women are caregivers and not so insightful and so on, then oddly enough, we will behave and respond in line with those stereotypes in at least some cases. And I think the article was sort of describing that result being found again in the teaching of philosophy. And yeah, I find the whole thing, so maybe you can be slightly more articulate.
I doubt it. I was going to ask you something about, because I know that like me, you've had various managerial type, leadership type, mentor type jobs, and I get like you. I've heard this many times. This type of data, and I always come back to the question about how we quality assure. Right? How do we say to someone, look, you think you're doing great in the classroom, but actually it's not going as well as you think, and of course people sometimes are self-aware enough to go, yeah, actually, okay, I see that, but some people just go, no, I'm brilliant. And in that case, it feels like you want to be able to point to something. So I wondered what you feel taking on board the points, right? But how do you respond to that sort of case?
I think it's honestly really hard, and I don't think that what I have is like a single straight down the line, one quick hack for your super excellent, insightful teaching assessment. I think there are a number of different things that I would want to encourage folks to think about doing, and to really kind of create a portfolio approach to thinking about how we evaluate teaching. And how we think about supporting each other to become better teaching practitioners, which actually I think is probably what matters more than anything else. So to start with, I think it's quite important to have an agreed sense of what the function of the teacher is. So what do we think we're trying to achieve in the classroom? Once we have a sense of that, we can start to work out what a good making and less good making features of that might be. I guess to put a little bit of skin on the bones, if you think that it's an important function of a teacher in a particular context to help people to understand things, then I guess one of the things that I want that teacher to be doing in the classroom is checking whether or not the students understand. So give them some information, check whether they understand it. If they don't, go back, make sure that they are understanding it, and then move on. And it's that, in order to assess that, I think the only thing you can do is observe it. I think you have to watch it. I want people reflecting on their teaching practice as well to make sure that they're being appropriately sensitive to other demands. But as I say, I wouldn't say that I have a single bullet, but a single silver bullet. But Andy, you're the National Teaching Fellow, right? So what's your answer?
What you just said. I think I genuinely think that's the right approach. What is the harder question is how you shift culture. So universities culture often is very individualistic and private in terms of academics and doing their lectures. We need to get a culture of peer observation in a non-judgmental, learning from each other way, which happens in FE and schools naturally. Also, I guess this, you'll probably smile at this, but there's a sense that university is so behind some of the obvious empirical data. So I've heard this stuff about gender affecting teaching evaluations probably for about 10 years, and universities seem quite slow to be able to react to things. And that's just an observation. I just think we need to be more agile, in that space. So it's just another observation. I don't know how we change that, but we need to have more observation, and we just need to be quicker off the mark and sensitive. But people still do these observations, and equally they'll say we are researchers and we will look at the data, and we'll still do it. It's like, well, that just looks incompatible. And it's that sort of thing which I find very strange.
I agree with you. And just to link back to what we were talking about with Man United earlier, I mean, you talk about that kind of an individualist approach and the need for peer review to try and help shift the culture. It feels a bit more like what we need is a team approach to things. Um,
Yes.
and apologies if you can hear my dog going nuts in the background right now. He's very excited. I think we might have someone trying to drop off a package, but there we go. But that kind of team ethos that's going to drive things. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And that you can see that in research as well. So at least in the art, or at least in philosophy, the norm is individual publications, and it seems a bit odd if you publish with 2, 3 people. Whereas if you're doing individual publication in some areas like sciences, I think they have about 30,000 people listed as the authors on their papers. So again, it's not even cultures within a university; it's within different departments and stuff. So yeah, it is about a team approach, but it's about trying to work out the levers for bringing about a team approach. And that's a complex question, which we haven't really got time to try and bottom out.
Maybe we'll cover it next time. Maybe we'll
Yeah, absolutely.
completely
First
solve
5 minutes.
that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
5. I was just going to give it 3.
Okay.
Fair enough. Well, we should start to wrap it up there. It's been good talking to you, Andy. I hope people have enjoyed listening. We'll be keeping an eye on what's going on in the world of philosophy over the next week, and we'll be back next time to talk to you about all of our, as ever, incredibly insightful reflections. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.